The Great Hall of Pax Eternum was the most beautiful place in the known galaxy, and on this particular morning, it was filled with every important creature from every important world that had ever signed a treaty or shaken a tentacle in the name of peace. Ambassador Lyra Chen stood near the front row in her dark blue formal suit, her hands clasped behind her back, watching the delegations file in, one by one, like a parade of the strangest things the universe had ever decided to create. There were the Marathi, tall and thin like living glass, their bodies catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the floor. There were the Brook, short and dense like boulders with legs, grumbling to each other in voices so deep the floor vibrated beneath their feet. There were the Anhari, floating silently in their anti-gravity chairs, their 6 eyes blinking in patterns that meant things only other Anhari understood. And then, at the very center of the hall, elevated on a platform made of polished black stone, sat the Velthari delegation. The Velthari were impressive creatures by any standard, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with armored skin the color of deep ocean water, and 4 arms that ended in clawed hands, capable of crushing starship hull plating like paper. Their supreme archon, Draven, sat at the head of their group like a king carved from living stone, his golden eyes scanning the room with the calm patience of a predator who had never once in his long life encountered anything that could threaten him. Today was supposed to be a celebration. 1,000 years ago, humanity and the Velthari Dominion had signed the Accord of Lasting Peace, ending what could have been the bloodiest war the galaxy had ever seen before it even started. In the centuries since, both civilizations had grown and traded and cooperated, and the galaxy had entered what historians called the Golden Millennium. Expected speeches about unity, maybe some poetry from the Anhari, and then a very long dinner with too many courses and not enough wine. She did not expect what happened next. Supreme Archon Draven rose from his seat, and the hall fell silent in the way that only a room full of creatures who had evolved on 100 different worlds could fall silent, completely, instantly, and with a sense of collective breath-holding that made the air itself feel heavier. Draven raised all 4 of his arms in the ancient Veltari gesture of formal address, and when he spoke, his voice rolled through the hall like distant thunder. 1,000 years ago, he began, the Veltari Dominion looked upon humanity and saw a species of potential, a species that burned bright, but burned recklessly, a species that we believed would, in time, learn its place among the stars. He paused, and his golden eyes swept the room. We were wrong. Delegations. But Draven continued without pause. In 1,000 years, humanity has not learned its place. It has devoured every place it has touched, spreading across the galaxy like a fire that refuses to die, growing and multiplying, and reaching into corners of the universe that were never meant for warm-blooded creatures who live for barely a century. Lyra felt the mood in the room shift like a ship turning in a storm, and a cold feeling began to settle in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but the sharp awareness that something was about to go very wrong. The Veltari Dominion has watched, and waited, and measured, Draven said, his voice growing harder with every word. And we have determined that the Accord of Lasting Peace was a mistake. A moment of weakness that allowed a dangerous species to grow beyond all acceptable limits. He reached into his robes and produced a crystal tablet that glowed with deep red light, the color of formal challenge in Velthari culture, the color of blood and fire and endings. Therefore, by the authority of the Velthari High Council, and in accordance with the ancient laws of Dominion, I hereby declare the Accord of Lasting Peace dissolved, and I declare a state of total war between the Velthari Dominion and the species known as humanity. The hall erupted. The Marathi shattered into panicked light patterns. The Bruk roared and stamped their feet. The Anhari spun in their chairs so fast their 6 eyes blurred into glowing circles. Every delegation was on its feet, or its equivalent. shouting or screaming or vibrating at frequencies that made Lyra's teeth ache. But Lyra herself did not move. She stood perfectly still, staring at Draven with an expression that the Velthari Archon could not read. An expression that started as blank surprise, and then slowly, like the sun rising over a quiet ocean, transformed into something that confused every alien in the hall. She smiled. It started small, just a twitch at the corner of her mouth. But it grew, and it kept growing. And then her shoulders began to shake. And then a sound escaped her lips that the Velthari translators initially flagged as a distress call, before correcting themselves. Ambassador Lyra Chen was laughing. Not a nervous laugh, not a frightened laugh, not the kind of laugh that creatures make when they do not know what else to do. This was a real laugh, deep and full and warm, the kind of laugh that comes from the belly, the kind that makes your eyes water and your ribs ache, the kind that is so genuine and so uncontrollable that it becomes contagious. And it did become contagious. Behind her, the other human delegates began to laugh too, first one, then three, then all of them, a chorus of laughter that rang through the great hall of Pax Eternum like music, like madness, like something the galaxy had never heard before in a moment like this. This Draven stared at them, and for the first time in his 300 years of life, he felt something he had no name for, something cold and small that crawled up his spine and whispered that perhaps he had made a terrible miscalculation. Lyra wiped a tear from her eye and straightened her suit. Still grinning so wide, her face hurt. "Archon, Draven," she said, her voice still shaking with the aftershocks of laughter. "I accept your declaration on behalf of humanity, and I will forward it to Earth immediately." She paused, and her grin became something sharper, something that showed teeth in a way that every predator species in the room instinctively understood. "I am sure the history department will find it absolutely adorable." She turned and walked out of the hall, still chuckling, and the other human delegates followed her like they were leaving a comedy show, rather than the opening act of an interstellar war. Stunned silence. And in that silence, the cold thing crawling up Draven's spine reached his brain and finally told him its name. It was doubt. 3 days after the declaration, the Veltari war machine began to move, and it was, by any reasonable measure, an impressive sight. 40,000 warships poured out of the shipyards of Veltar Prime like a river of polished black metal, each one bristling with weapons that the Veltari had spent a century designing and building in secret, each one crewed by soldiers who had trained their entire lives for this moment. Supreme Archon Draven stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Undying Will, and watched his fleet arrange itself into the traditional Veltari attack formation, a massive crescent shape that could envelope an entire star system and crush it from all sides at once. His chief intelligence officer, Commander Velshar, stood beside him with a data tablet clutched in 2 of her 4 hands, her blue armored face set in an expression of professional confidence. "The humans maintain approximately 600 combat-rated vessels across their territory," she reported, scrolling through data that had been collected over decades of careful espionage. "Their primary weapon systems are kinetic-based, supplemented by directed energy arrays that our shields are rated to absorb without difficulty." Draven nodded slowly, his golden eyes fixed on the stars ahead. "And their defensive capabilities?" "Standard barrier shields, Generation 4 at most," Velshar said. "Their last documented military engagement was the Kreth Swarm conflict in 3402, over 1,000 years ago, and the technology they deployed at that time was, by our current standards, primitive." She pulled up a holographic display showing the human fleet composition: medium-sized cruisers, a handful of carriers, some fast attack frigates, and a collection of aging patrol ships that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a battle line. Our projections indicate full conquest within 6 to 8 standard weeks, she said. There was a note of satisfaction in her voice that she did not bother to hide. Draven studied the display for a long moment, then turned his golden eyes toward Velshar. Then explain to me, he said quietly, why they laughed. Velshar's confident expression flickered for just a moment before she recovered. Cultural response to stress, she said firmly. Humans are known to use humor as a coping mechanism in situations of extreme danger. It is a psychological defense, nothing more. Draven said nothing, but the doubt that had taken root in his mind 3 days ago in the Great Hall had not gone away. It had grown, quietly and persistently, like a weed in the cracks of his certainty. 12,000 light-years away, on the human colony world of Meridian, Admiral Kofi Asante sat in his office with his boots on his desk and a cup of coffee in his hand, reading the Velthari Declaration of War for the 3rd time. He was not laughing anymore. The smile had not left his face. His aide, Lieutenant Commander Priya Sharma, stood in the doorway with a tablet of her own, waiting for orders that she suspected would be unlike any orders given in over 1,000 years. So, Asante said, setting down his coffee, they actually did it. They actually did it, sir. 40,000 ships. 40,000 and change, according to DeepScan. Asante shook his head slowly, the way a teacher might shake their head at a student who had confidently written the wrong answer on a test and then underlined it twice. Pull up their fleet specs. Sharma tapped her tablet, and a holographic display appeared above Asante's desk, showing the Veltari armada in detail. Their weapons, their shields, their engines, their armor composition, everything that humanity's intelligence networks had quietly catalogued over the past century. Asante studied it for exactly 4 seconds. They are still using linear space propulsion, he said. Yes, sir. Their weapons are still thermally based. Yes, sir. Their shields operate on a single frequency rotation. Yes, sir. Asante leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was not amused anymore. It was something closer to sad. They have no idea, he said quietly. They genuinely have no idea. And they did not. Because the Veltari had made a mistake that every intelligence agency in history had made at one point or another. They had confused what they could see with what actually existed. For 1,000 years, the galaxy had watched humanity's public face. Merchant fleets carrying goods between colonies, civilian research stations publishing papers on agriculture and medicine, diplomatic envoys attending conferences and signing trade agreements. What the galaxy had not seen, what nobody had seen, was what humanity had been doing in the quiet places, in the deep places, in the spaces between the spaces where the laws of physics bent like wet paper, and the word impossible was treated less like a wall and more like a suggestion. Humanity had not stopped advancing during the Golden Millennium. Humanity had never stopped advancing. They had simply stopped showing anyone. In classified research stations, hidden inside folded dimensions that did not appear on any star chart, human scientists had rewritten the rules of energy, of matter, of space and time themselves. In testing grounds that existed in parallel layers of reality, human engineers had built weapons that did not destroy, but simply rearranged. Weapons that could take an enemy fleet and move it to the other side of the galaxy in the time it took to blink. Weapons that could reach inside a ship and turn off its engines like flipping a switch. Weapons that could fold space around a planet like a blanket and make it simply vanish from every sensor in existence. And they had built these things not because they wanted to fight, but because they remembered what it was like to be a species that had nearly destroyed itself 100 times over. And they had sworn with the kind of quiet, iron-hard determination that only a species forged in its own fire could possess, that they would never be caught unprepared again. Admiral Asante finished his coffee and set the cup down with a soft click. "Issue a general recall to all reserve personnel," he said. "Dust off the deep storage assets and run full diagnostics. Some of that equipment has not been activated since the Kreth campaign, and I want everything functioning before the Valthari reach the border." "Rules of engagement, sir?" Asante thought about this for a long moment. "Minimum force," he said finally. "Disable. Do not destroy. I do not want a single Valthari life lost if we can avoid it." "Sir, they declared war on us." "Yes, they did," Asante said, and the sad look returned to his eyes. "And they did it because they do not understand what they are looking at. They see our merchant ships and our farming colonies and our research papers about better tomato yields, and they think that is all we are." He stood up and walked to the window of his office, looking out at the green fields of Meridian stretching to the horizon under a sky full of moons. "They think 1,000 years of peace made us soft," he said. "They do not understand that 1,000 years of peace is the hardest thing humanity has ever done. Harder than any war, harder than any battle, harder than crossing the void between stars with nothing but hope and aluminum foil holding us together." He turned back to Sharma. "We did not stop being dangerous, Priya. We just found better things to do with our time." Sharma nodded slowly. "And when they hit the moon border?" Asante smiled again, and this time there was no sadness in it. Only the calm, steady confidence of a man who knew exactly what was going to happen, and felt sorry for the people who did not. "When they hit the border," he said, "they will learn the difference between a species that has been at peace for 1,000 years and a species that chose peace for 1,000 years. Far away, in the cold black space between stars, the Veltari Armada burns toward the human border like a spear thrown by a god. They carried enough firepower to crack planets and boil oceans. They believed they were unstoppable. They were about to find out what humanity had been building in the dark. The border colony of New Carthage was not an impressive place by galactic standards. It was a farming world, plain and simple. 12 million people spread across rolling green plains and golden wheat fields under a sky that held 2 small suns and 1 oversized moon, that the colonists had affectionately named Big Gerald, for reasons that had been lost to history approximately 400 years ago. The people of New Carthage grew food, raised children, argued about the weather, and generally lived the kind of quiet, unremarkable lives that made for terrible stories but wonderful civilizations. They were not soldiers. They were not warriors. They were bakers and teachers and engineers and parents who had never heard a weapon fired in anger in their entire lives. And on a clear Tuesday morning, while a woman named Hannah Park was pouring her second cup of coffee and watching her daughter chase a cat through the garden, 2,000 Veltari warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above their world. Admiral Kethra of the Velthari 3rd Assault Fleet stood on her bridge and looked down at New Carthage with the cold, professional eye of a career military officer who had spent her entire life training for exactly this moment. "Scan the planet," she ordered. Her sensor officer ran the scan and reported back within seconds. 12.3 million life signs, all civilian. No military installations detected. No orbital defense platforms. No armed vessels in the system. Kethra allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction. This was going to be easy. "Open a channel to the surface," she said. "Broadcast the standard terms of surrender. They have 1 hour to comply before we begin orbital bombardment." The message was sent, and Kethra settled back into her command chair to wait, fully expecting that a defenseless farming colony would do the sensible thing and surrender immediately. 58 minutes later, a reply came back from the surface. It was from Hannah Park, who had been elected mayor of New Carthage's largest settlement 3 years ago, primarily because nobody else wanted the job, and partly because she made excellent banana bread that she brought to every council meeting. The message read, "Dear Velthari Fleet, Thank you for your message, which gave us all a good laugh over breakfast. We respectfully decline your offer of surrender, and suggest you turn around before you embarrass yourselves further. Also, your ships are blocking Big Gerald, and my daughter is upset about it. Warm regards, Mayor Park. Kethra read the message twice, decided it was the most insulting thing she had ever received in her military career, and gave the order to fire. 2,000 Velthari warships opened up with everything they had. Plasma cannons roared, energy lances blazed, kinetic slugs the size of buildings streaked toward the planet's surface at a fraction of the speed of light. It was enough firepower to crack a continent. It hit nothing. Every single shot, every beam, every slug, they all simply bent about 300 kilometers above the surface, curved gracefully like water flowing around a stone, and redirected into the nearest sun, where they vanished without a trace. Kethra stared at her tactical display, which was showing her something her training had not prepared her for, a complete 100% weapons failure against a farming colony. What happened? She demanded. Her weapons officer looked at his console, looked at the planet, looked at his console again, and then said 5 words that would later become famous throughout the galaxy. I do not know. Down on the surface of New Carthage, Hannah Park sipped her coffee and watched the light show in the sky with mild interest. Her daughter, Yuki, stood on the porch railing and pointed at the flashes of redirected weapons fire streaking across the atmosphere like artificial shooting stars. Pretty, Yuki said. Very pretty, Hannah agreed. She was not afraid. And the reason she was not afraid was the same reason that nobody on New Carthage was afraid. Because every human colony, no matter how small, no matter how far from Earth, was protected by a spatial fold barrier that had been installed so long ago and worked so reliably that most colonists had forgotten it was even there. It was like gravity, or air, or the fact that the sun would rise in the morning. It simply was, and had always been, and worrying about it would be like worrying about whether mathematics would still work tomorrow. Up in orbit, Kethra was not having a good day. She had fired everything in her arsenal at the planet below, and the planet had responded by redirecting her weapons into a star, with the casual indifference of someone brushing a crumb off a table, was about to order a second barrage, when her sensor officer made a sound, a small, strangled sound that Velthari made when their brains encountered something they could not process. Admiral, the officer said, a ship is. Complete your sentence, officer. A ship has just appeared, Admiral, but it did not come from anywhere. It came from nothing. There was empty space, and then there was a ship, and my instruments cannot explain the difference. Kethra looked at the main display, and there it was. A single human vessel, hanging in space between her fleet and the planet, like a pebble between a river and a wall. It was small, absurdly small, barely larger than a Velthari shuttle, a tiny silver thing that looked more like a teardrop than a warship. Its name was written on the hull in standard galactic script, and when Kethra read it, the cold feeling that had been building in her stomach since the weapons failure got significantly colder. The ship was called the Laughter. It broadcast a message on all frequencies, in perfect Velthari. Attention Velthari fleet, you have fired upon a protected human settlement. This is your one and only warning. Leave this system immediately. Kethra was a proud officer from a proud species, and she had 2,000 warships under her command, and she was not about to take orders from something that was smaller than her personal shuttle. All ships, she said through clenched teeth, target that vessel. Fire. 2,000 ships fired at the Laughter. The Laughter did not move. It did not dodge. It did not deploy shields. It did not do anything at all, except hang there in the void, and accept every single shot that hit it. Plasma, kinetic, energy, all of it, absorbing the combined firepower of an entire assault fleet, the way a sponge absorbs water. And then, in a moment that would be replayed on every news channel in the galaxy for the next 100 years, the laughter glowed. It glowed with all the energy it had absorbed, shining like a tiny star, and then it released that energy in a single, precisely targeted pulse that spread across the Veltari fleet like a wave. 200 ships went dark. Not destroyed, their hulls were intact, their crews were alive, their life support was still running, but every weapon, every engine, every navigation system, every piece of military technology on those 200 ships simply stopped working, as if someone had reached inside each one and gently pulled out its teeth. The laughter broadcast again. That was your warning. The next one will not be. Kethra looked at her tactical display, which now showed 200 of her ships floating dead in space, and one tiny human vessel sitting exactly where it had been before, without so much as a scratch on its hull. She thought about her orders, her duty, her pride, the 10,000 years of Velthari military tradition that told her to never retreat, to never show weakness, to fight until the last ship and the last breath. And then she thought about the fact that a single ship the size of a shuttle had just disabled 10% of her fleet by absorbing their own weapons fire and throwing it back at them, and that it had done so with the same effort that a person might use to swat a fly. All ships, she said quietly, and the words tasted like ashes in her mouth. Retreat. Fall back to Velthari space, maximum speed. The third assault fleet turned and ran. On the surface of New Carthage, Yuki Park watched the lights in the sky fade and disappear. And she turned to her mother with the devastated expression of a child whose entertainment had been taken away too soon. The pretty lights are gone, she said. Hana smiled and picked her daughter up. They will come back another day, sweetheart. Never did. The news of the Third Assault Fleet's retreat hit the Veltari Dominion like a hammer to the skull. Admiral Kethra's report was classified immediately, but in a civilization of 8 billion people connected by faster-than-light communication networks, classified was just a polite word for everyone will know by dinner. The footage spread like wildfire. 2,000 warships firing everything they had at a farming planet and achieving nothing. A single human ship the size of a shuttle absorbing an entire fleet's firepower and spitting it back like a bored child returning a thrown ball. And then the retreat, the terrible, humiliating retreat that broke a 10,000-year record of Veltari military invincibility. Supreme Archon Draven watched the footage in his private chambers aboard the Undying Will, and when it finished, he sat in silence for a very long time. Then he played it again. Then he called his war council. The border engagement was an anomaly, he told them, his voice harder than starship armor. The humans clearly concentrated their most advanced defensive technology on their border colonies to create the illusion of strength, a bluff, nothing more. His admirals nodded, because nodding was what you did when the Supreme Archon told you something, even if a small voice in the back of your mind was screaming that maybe, just maybe, it was not a bluff at all. We will bypass the border colonies entirely, Draven continued. The full armada, all 40,000 ships, will strike directly at their core worlds, hit the heart, and the limbs will die. And so the full Veltari armada launched, burning through space toward the center of human territory, with the kind of grim determination that only a species fighting to preserve its self-image could muster. What followed would later be described by Veltari historians as the humiliation, though human historians preferred the gentler term. The correction. It began on the third day of the advance, when the 7th Strike Group, 800 warships under the command of Admiral Torvek, attempted to pass through a region of space that human star charts labeled as empty. The 800 ships entered the region at full speed. The 800 ships exited the region at full speed. They were back where they started. Not turned around, not redirected, not ambushed, simply moved, as if some enormous invisible hand had picked them up and placed them back at their starting point, the way a parent might pick up a wandering toddler and set it back in its playpen. Torvek ordered his ships forward again. They were moved back again. He tried a third time, taking a different route. He ended up back at the starting point, but this time all the labels on every console, on every ship, had been changed to a human language called French, and nobody could figure out how to change them. Back. On the 5th day, the 12th Heavy Carrier Group dropped out of FTL to find that every single weapon system on every single ship had been completely and cleanly uninstalled. Not damaged, not disabled, but physically removed, as if they had never been there at all, replaced by empty spaces where cannons used to be, and neat little notes in Velthari script that read, "We borrowed these. You can have them back when you calm down." On the 7th day, an entire battlecruiser squadron found their navigation computers had been reprogrammed to play human classical music instead of displaying star charts. And for 3 full hours, the bridges of 12 Velthari warships echoed with something called Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, while their crews frantically tried to regain control. No one was hurt. Not a single Velthari soldier was killed or even injured. And that, more than anything else, was what terrified them. Because the Velthari understood war. Had waged it for 10,000 years against dozens of species, and they knew what war looked like. War was fire and blood and death and the screaming of the wounded and the silence of the dead. This was not war. This was something else entirely. This was a species so far beyond them that it could not even be bothered to fight back properly. A species that treated the most powerful military force in the galaxy the way a patient adult treats a child throwing a tantrum, with firm, gentle, utterly unshakable control. On Mars, deep inside the Red Mountain Fortress that served as humanity's strategic command center, the mood was calm but serious. Admiral Kofi Asante stood before a holographic map of the galaxy that showed every Veltari ship as a small red dot, and every human asset as a blue one, and the blue dots outnumbered the red ones by a margin that would have made the Veltari sick if they had known about it. But Asante was not thinking about numbers. He was thinking about what came after. "The military situation is handled," he said to the assembled council of admirals, scientists, and diplomats. "We could end this today. We could shut down every ship in their fleet, fold their entire armada into a pocket dimension, and have them home in time for dinner." He paused. "The question is, what happens after we win?" Dr. Miriam Osei, the council's chief xenopsychologist and the foremost human expert on Velthari culture, rose from her seat with the careful gravity of someone about to deliver very bad news. "If we defeat them completely," she said, "they will destroy themselves." The room went quiet. "The Velthari are a pride-based hierarchical civilization," Osei continued. "Their entire cultural identity, their religion, their social structure, their sense of self, is built on the belief that they are the strongest species in the galaxy. It is not arrogance, it is architecture. It away, and the building collapses." She pulled up historical data on her display. Every time in Veltari history that a major military defeat has occurred, the losing faction has undergone what they call the silence, a cultural collapse characterized by mass withdrawal, refusal to reproduce, and in extreme cases, collective self-termination. She let that sink in. If we humiliate them, if we show the galaxy that the Veltari are powerless against us, we will not defeat an enemy. We will kill a civilization, and 8 billion people will pay the price for the arrogance of one Archon. Asante closed his eyes. This was the part that the galaxy would never understand. The part that made humanity different from every other powerful species that had ever risen to dominance. Any other civilization in humanity's position would have crushed the Veltari without a second thought, would have used their overwhelming advantage to break their enemies so completely that they could never threaten anyone again. But humanity remembered its own history, the wars and genocides and collapses. the times when victory had tasted like poison because it came at the cost of someone else's existence. And they had learned, slowly and painfully over thousands of years, that the hardest part of being powerful was not winning. It was winning without breaking the loser. Far away, on a Velthari supply ship at the rear of the Armada, a young sub-commander named Rin Tal sat alone in the ship's archive room surrounded by data tablets and old records. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be running inventory checks on ammunition supplies, but instead she was doing something far more dangerous. She was researching the enemy, not the sanitized intelligence briefings that Command distributed, not the propaganda broadcasts that painted humans as weak and decadent, but the real records that the Veltari had intercepted and filed away and never bothered to study because they had already decided that they knew everything they needed to know. She was reading about human history, and what she found there terrified her more than any weapon ever could. She found records of a species that had spent most of its existence trying to destroy itself. Wars that killed millions, weapons that could crack the very atoms of matter apart, ideologies that turned neighbor against neighbor with a ferocity that made Veltari warfare look like a polite disagreement. She found a species that had clawed its way out of its own darkness, not once, not twice, but hundreds of times, each time bloodied and broken and somehow still standing, still reaching, still refusing to stay down. And she found the moment, the specific, documented, terrible, beautiful moment, when that species had looked at everything it was and everything it had done and said, enough. Rin Tal sat back and stared at the ceiling of the archive room, and she understood something that Supreme Archon Draven did not understand, something that changed everything. They did not stop being warriors, she whispered to the empty room. They just stopped needing to be. And in that moment, in a dusty archive room, on a supply ship at the back of a doomed fleet, the first seed of peace was planted. But it would need time to grow, and time was running out because the Veltari Armada was approaching human core space, and what waited for them there would change the galaxy forever. The Veltari Armada arrived at the Sol system expecting to find the soft, beating heart of human civilization. A single yellow star, a handful of small rocky planets, and a species that had grown too comfortable to defend its home. What they found instead made 40,000 warship crews fall completely silent. The sun, humanity's home star, was encased in a lattice of energy collectors so vast and so intricate that it looked like someone had wrapped a god in a net made of light, and the energy flowing through that lattice was enough to power every civilization in the galaxy simultaneously, and still have enough left over to do it twice more. Earth hung in space like a jewel in a crown, surrounded by a web of defense platforms that were so old their hulls had been pitted by micrometeor impacts accumulated over centuries. And yet every single one of them hummed with a quiet, patient power that the Veltari sensors could detect, but could not measure. Numbers went beyond what their instruments were designed to display. Jupiter had been converted into a shipyard, not on its surface, but inside it, in the crushing depths where pressure turned gas into liquid into metal, and the signatures of the vessels being built down there suggested ships that made the laughter look like a rowboat. Saturn's rings were gone, replaced by a sensor array so sensitive it could detect a single heartbeat on a planet 3 galaxies away, and it had been tracking the Veltari Armada since the moment they left their home system weeks ago. Mars glowed with the lights of 10 billion people living inside and on top of a world that humanity had rebuilt from a dead rock into a garden, and beneath its surface, the red mountain fortress pulsed with the calm, steady rhythm of a species that had been ready for this moment for a very long time. Supreme Archon Draven stood on his bridge and stared at the display, and for the first time since the declaration of war, He allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. This was not a civilization that had stagnated during 1,000 years of peace. This was a civilization that had used 1,000 years of peace to become something that the galaxy had never seen before. Not a military power, not an empire, not a conqueror, but something else entirely. Something that had no name in any alien language, because no other species had ever achieved it. They had become a species that could destroy anything, and had chosen to destroy nothing. "Archon," his communications officer said in a voice that trembled, "we are receiving a transmission, on all frequencies, from everywhere." Every screen on every Velthari ship lit up at the same moment. The message was simple, written in Velthari script, in the formal style reserved for invitations between equals. "Come talk to us." Draven stared at those 4 words for a long time. Thought about ordering his fleet to attack, about going down fighting, about making one last glorious stand against an enemy that could swat his entire armada like an insect. But he was old, and he was tired, and somewhere beneath the armor of his pride, there was still a mind capable of recognizing the truth, when it stood in front of him, wearing the light of a caged star. "Stand down, all weapons," he said. "Archon, stand down, all weapons," he repeated, and his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a decision that would change the history of his people forever. "And accept their invitation." 1 hour later, Draven materialized aboard the human flagship HCS Olive Branch, a vessel so large that it had its own weather systems, and so advanced that its hull seemed to shift and breathe like a living thing. He expected to find soldiers, guns, chains, the machinery of conquest and humiliation that he himself would have prepared for a defeated enemy. Instead, he found a room. A simple, warm, well-lit room, with a wooden table and 2 chairs, and a window that looked out at the stars. And sitting at the table, with a steaming pot of tea and 2 cups, was Ambassador Lyra Chen. She was smiling, not the sharp, teeth-showing grin she had worn in the great hall of Pax Eternum, but something softer, something warmer, something that looked dangerously close to kindness. "Please sit down, Archon," she said, and she poured him a cup of tea without asking whether he wanted one. Draven sat. He was the supreme Archon of the Veltari Dominion, commander of the most powerful military force his species had ever assembled, and he sat in a wooden chair and accepted a cup of tea from a woman who was shorter than his arm. And he did not feel conquered. He felt, and this confused him more than anything, welcome. "You knew," he said. It was not a question. "We knew," Chen confirmed. "We detected the construction of your war fleet 97 years ago. We watched it grow. We tracked every ship, every weapon, every supply line. And you did nothing. We hoped you would change your mind." Draven closed his golden eyes. "Why?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that would have horrified him if he had been capable of caring about such things anymore. "Why not stop us? Why not crush the fleet in its cradle? Why not come to Velthar Prime and dictate terms while our ships were still being built? You had the power, you had the knowledge, you had every reason." Chen took a sip of her tea and looked out the window at the stars. "Because power without restraint is just violence," she said, "and we have had enough violence to last us until the end of time." She set down her cup and looked at him directly, and her dark eyes held something that Draven had never seen in the eyes of an enemy. Not pity, not contempt, triumph, but understanding. "We remember what it is like to be afraid, Archon. We remember what it is like to look at the universe and see only threats, to believe that the only way to be safe is to be the strongest, to be so terrified of weakness that you mistake peace for surrender." She leaned forward. "We spent 10,000 years living exactly the way you live now, fighting everything, conquering everything, destroying everything that we could not control. And it nearly killed us, not once but 100 times. And when we finally stopped, it was not because we became weak. Her voice was gentle, but it carried a weight that pressed against Draven's chest like a hand. It was because we became strong enough to choose something better. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Draven asked the question that he needed to ask, the question that burned in him like a star. "What do you want from us?" Shen smiled. "Have a future," she said. "We want your children to grow up in a galaxy where they do not have to be afraid. We want your scientists to have access to the same knowledge our scientists have. We want your artists and your poets and your builders to create things that the universe has never seen before." She slid a data tablet across the table. Full technological exchange, joint research programs, a seat on the new Galactic Council, not as a defeated enemy, but as a partner and an equal. The only condition is that the wars of conquest stop, not just against us, but against everyone, forever. Draven picked up the tablet and read it, and what he found there was not the terms of a surrender. It was an invitation, written with the same careful respect that one would use when asking a friend to dinner. "Why?" he asked again, and this time the word was barely a whisper. Chen reached across the table and placed her hand on one of his 4 massive clawed hands. And the gesture was so unexpected and so gentle that the Supreme Archon of the Velthari Dominion felt something hot and unfamiliar behind his golden eyes. "Because we remember what it was like to be where you are," she said, "and we swore that we would never make anyone else feel that way." 3 days later, the galaxy watched as a new treaty was signed aboard the Olive Branch, not in the great hall of Pax Eternum with its pomp and ceremony, but in a simple room with a wooden table and a pot of tea that had gone cold. The first signature on the Velthari side did not belong to Supreme Archon Draven. It belonged to Sub-Commander Rintal, the young officer who had sat alone in an archive room and read the true history of humanity, who had understood before anyone else in her fleet what they were truly facing, had been promoted to lead the Velthari delegation at Draven's personal request. "You saw the truth before I did," the old Archon told her. "Should be the one to sign us into the future." Rintal signed with a steady hand, and when she looked up at Ambassador Chen, the human woman winked at her, and Rintal felt something she had never felt before in her military career. She felt hope. The galaxy-wide broadcast went out that evening, a joint statement from humanity and the Velthari Dominion, announcing the end of the war that had lasted less than 2 weeks, and the beginning of something new, something that had no precedent in galactic history. On 100 different worlds, 100 different species watched the broadcast, and what they felt was not relief, though there was plenty of that. What they felt was awe, because they had just watched the most powerful civilization in the galaxy win a war without firing a single lethal shot, without taking a single life, without demanding a single concession born of cruelty. They had watched humanity win with laughter and patience and tea and an open hand. And they understood, finally and completely, that the scariest thing about humans was not what they could do, it was what they chose not to. On New Carthage, Hannah Park sat on her porch with her daughter in her lap, watching the broadcast on a small screen balanced on the railing. "Mama," Yuki said, "are the light people coming back?" Hannah smiled and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "No, sweetheart, I do not think they will be coming back to fight, but maybe one day they will come back to visit, and we can show them the wheat fields and Big Gerald, and maybe they will stay for dinner." Yuki considered this with the grave seriousness of a 6-year-old evaluating a major diplomatic proposition. "Can they bring their pretty lights?" Hannah laughed. "I will ask," she said, and somewhere in the vast star-filled dark, a galaxy that had spent 10,000 years afraid finally took a breath, and let it out, and began, slowly, carefully, and with the quiet, stubborn hope that only living things can carry, to build something worth keeping. The Velthari had declared war, expecting to teach humanity a lesson. In the end, it was humanity that taught one, not with fire, but with laughter, patience, and an open hand.